The evening air inside the Northbridge auction house was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged brandy, and the unspoken, sharp edge of social judgment. This wasn't just a place where art was sold. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a fortress of mahogany and gold leaf were the entrance. Fee was a lineage of wealth and a wardrobe that cost more than a mid-sized home. The chandeliers, massive clusters of hand-cut crystal, hung from the ceiling like frozen explosions of light, casting a shimmering glow over the assembly of New York's most influential families in the center of this sea of silk. Sequins and seven-figure watches stood Olivia. She felt less like a guest and more like a smudge of gray on a pristine white canvas. Her dress was a simple, knee-length black, well-made, and classic, but devoid of the intricate beadwork or the labels that the other women wore like armor. She wore no necklace, no sparkling earrings, and no rings. To the vultures circling the room, her lack of ornamentation was a loud, discordant note in a symphony of opulence. They didn't see a woman. They saw a trespasser. Olivia took a deep breath, the cool, filtered air doing little to steady the slight tremble in her hands. She adjusted the strap of her modest purse and looked down at the auction catalog. She wasn't here for the social validation or the thrill of the hunt. She was here for a ghost. Specifically, she was here for Lot 42. Tucked away in the archives of her memory was the image of her grandfather, Professor Elias Thorne. He hadn't been a man of money, but he had been a man of immense richness and spirit. He had spent his life in the dusty corners of university greenhouses and the humid depths of tropical forests, studying the medicinal properties of rare flora. He believed that nature held the keys to healing the world, and he had spent his final years chasing the legacy of his own mentor, William Thornwell. The book in tonight's auction, a 19th-century volume of expeditionary botany, was more than just paper and ink. It contained Thornwell's original, handwritten notes her grandfather had spoken of with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. For Olivia, winning this book wasn't about the leather binding. It was about reclaiming a piece of her soul and honoring the man who had taught her that a person's worth was measured by what they gave to the world, not what they took from it. This world is a garden, Livy, he used to tell her, his voice raspy but warm. Some people are only interested in the flowers they can pick and show off. But the real treasure is in the roots, the parts that heal, the parts that ground us. Never forget where you come from. She had promised her husband, Daniel, that she would meet him there. Dan was her rock, the one person who saw her for exactly who she was, regardless of the billionaire status the world had thrust upon him. But a delayed flight from a business summit in Chicago had left him stranded on a tarmac, and he had urged her to go ahead. That book belongs to your family history, Olivia, he had told her over the phone, his voice steadying her nerves. Don't let anyone intimidate you. I'll be there as soon as the wheels touch down. But as she stood there alone, the weight of 100 judgmental eyes began to press in. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Victoria Sinclair entered the room. Victoria was the unofficial queen of the Northbridge social circuit, a woman whose family name was etched into the cornerstones of half the buildings in the city. She was draped in a Chanel suit that shimmered with subtle metallic threads, and her neck was adorned with a diamond collar that caught the light with every practiced tilt of her head. She didn't just walk. She navigated the room with the predatory grace of someone who knew exactly where. Everyone sat on the social ladder. Victoria's eyes, as cold and blue as a glacier, eventually landed on Olivia. A slow, mocking smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. To Victoria, Olivia was a curiosity, a glitch in the system. She glided toward the younger woman, her champagne flute held like a scepter. My goodness, Victoria purred, her voice loud enough to draw a small, eager circle of onlookers. I think someone might have taken a wrong turn on their way to the public library. Are you lost, dear? Or perhaps you're here to help with the catering. The service has been a bit slow tonight. Olivia felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to look away. I'm a registered bidder, Mrs. Sinclair. I'm here for the Thornwell collection. A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the nearby group. Victoria raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, her expression one of faux concern. The Thornwell botany book. Lot 42? Victoria let out a sharp, melodic laugh. That starts at $50,000, darling. I don't mean to be blunt, but looking at that charmingly minimalist outfit, I suspect your budget might be better suited for the gift shop across the street. This isn't a place for sentiment. It's a place for serious collectors. I am aware of the opening bid, Olivia replied, her voice remarkably level despite the pounding of her heart. And I have no intention of leaving without it. Victoria's smile turned sharp. She signaled to a young man in a tuxedo, James, a junior coordinator for the auction house. James, darling, there seems to be a bit of a clerical oversight. Could you be a dear and verify our guest's financial pre-qualification? We wouldn't want any unfortunate interruptions during the bidding process for the high-value items. James looked pained. He knew who Olivia was registered as, but he also knew that crossing Victoria Sinclair was professional suicide. He approached Olivia with a nervous cough. Ma'am, I'm terribly sorry, but for bids exceeding $20,000, we require a verified line of credit or a bank guarantee on file. The system doesn't seem to show a recognizable account for you. I provided the necessary documentation when I registered this morning, Olivia said, her dignity the only thing keeping her upright, while Victoria interjected, her eyes sparkling with malice. System errors happen. But until it's resolved, perhaps it's best if you move to the back. You're blocking the view for the people who actually intend to participate. 8. The humiliation was a physical weight. Olivia was ushered toward the rear of the hall, near the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. People she had never met looked at her with a mix of pity and disdain, whispers trailing her like smoke. She felt small, isolated, and for a moment she wondered if she should just leave. But then she thought of her grandfather's worn notebooks and the way his hands used to shake with excitement when he talked about the anal potential of the Thornwell plants. She stayed. The auctioneer took the podium, his voice a rhythmic, hypnotic drone that filled the cavernous room. One by one, treasures of history and art were sold to the highest bidders. A Ming vase went for $300,000. A lost sketch by a French master went for $500,000. With every strike of the gavel, the atmosphere in the room grew more electric, more intoxicated by the scent of money. Finally, the moment arrived. Ladies and gentlemen, we moved to Lot 42, the auctioneer announced. The Thornwell First Edition Expeditionary Flora. This volume includes the personal, handwritten marginalia of Professor William Thornwell himself, detailing botanical discoveries previously thought lost to time. We shall open the bidding at $50,000. Olivia raised her paddle with a steady hand. The room went silent. Victoria Sinclair, who had been laughing with a group of friends in the front row, stiffened. She leaned over and whispered something to the auctioneer, her eyes never leaving Olivia. The auctioneer hesitated, his brow furrowing. He looked toward Olivia, then back to Victoria, then toward the manager who was standing in the wings. Pardon me, he said into the microphone, his voice echoing. We have a request for a temporary suspension of this lot to verify the standing of the current bidder. The collective gaze of the room turned toward Olivia again. It was a firing squad of stares. I have already told you, Olivia said, her voice projecting through the silence. I am qualified. This book has a personal significance to my family that transcends its market value. Victoria stood up, turning to face the room. Her voice was dripping with condescension. Sentiment is a lovely thing, dear, but it doesn't pay the bills of an auction house of this caliber. We are here to ensure the integrity of the event. If you cannot prove you belong here, you are simply wasting everyone's time. The auctioneer looked ready to move on, pressured by the social weight of the Sinclair name. Perhaps we should move Lot 42 to the end of the evening. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the salon swung open with a force that seemed to rattle the chandeliers. The air in the room didn't just change, it shifted entirely. A man stepped into the light, his presence commanding a silence that was far more profound than the one Victoria had manufactured. He wore a navy blue suit that was the epitome of understated power bespoke, perfect and radiating an aura of absolute authority. It was Daniel Foster. In the world of global finance, Dan was a legend. He was the man who moved markets with a single phone call. The billionaire whose face had graced the covers of every major business magazine for a decade. But to Olivia, he was just Don, the man who loved her for her mind and her heart. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He didn't look at the manager, who was now scrambling toward him with a look of frantic terror. He looked only at Olivia. "I'm sorry I'm late, sweetheart," Dan said, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying to every corner of the room. The weather in Chicago was being stubborn. He walked through the center aisle, the crowd partying for him, not out of politeness, but out of a sudden, desperate need to stay out of his way. He reached Olivia, who was still standing in the shadows of the back row, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture was simple, but in that room, it was a declaration of war against anyone who had dared to look down on her. The auction manager arrived, blessed bowing. "Mr. Foster, what an incredible honor. We had no idea you were attending tonight. Had we known, we would have arranged the private suite." "I believe you were having some trouble with my wife's bid," Dan interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the sharp, cold edge of a diamond. Victoria Sinclair looked as though she had been struck. Her face, previously flushed with the triumph of her cruelty, turned a ghostly shade of white. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Your wife?" she finally managed to choke out. Dan turned his gaze toward Victoria. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes was one of complete clinical understanding of exactly what had been happening before he arrived. He dismissed her with a single, uninterested glance and turned back to the podium. "The auction for the Thornwell book," Dan said to the auctioneer, who was now visibly trembling. "It was at 50,000, I believe?" The auctioneer swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the gavel. "Yes, sir. 50,000 is the opening bid." $1 million, Dan stated. The silence that followed was so absolute that you could hear the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. A woman in the third row let out a soft, strangled gasp. A waiter near the bar actually dropped a tray. The sound of breaking glass shattering the frozen moment. It wasn't just the amount. It was the fact that he had multiplied the value by 20 without even blinking. It wasn't a bid. It was an erasure. He was erasing the humiliation, erasing the mockery, and erasing the very idea that anyone in that room had the right to question. Olivia's place. Victoria Sinclair looked as if her world had collapsed. The friends who had been tittering at her side only minutes ago were now leaning away from her, their eyes fixed on the floor or the ceiling, terrified that their association with her would poison their own standing in Dan Foster's world. The social hierarchy of the room was being shredded and reassembled in real time. $1 million, the auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, a desperate, hopeless search for another bid. Is there any other interest in Lot 42? No one moved. No one breathed. The very thought of bidding against Daniel Foster was absurd. The thought of bidding against him after he had just publicly defended his wife was social and financial suicide. "Going once," the auctioneer said, his gavel hand shaking. "Going twice?" The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. "Sold to Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Foster for $1 million. Dan didn't celebrate. He didn't look around the room to gloat. He simply took Olivia's hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm. "Let's go get your book, Livy," he whispered, as they walked toward the front of the room to sign the papers. The atmosphere was surreal. The same people who had sneered at Olivia's simple black dress now tried to catch her eye with sycophantic smiles. Men who had ignored her presence now straightened their ties and tried to think of a way to introduce themselves to Dan. The elderly socialite who had earlier whispered about Olivia's lack of breeding now leaned toward her companion and said, loud enough to be heard, "I always knew there was something exceptionally refined about her. You can tell by the way she carries herself. True class is always understated, don't you think?" Victoria remained paralyzed. She was a statue of vanished relevance. Her carefully constructed empire of gossip and gatekeeping had been dismantled by a man who hadn't even raised his voice. As the Fosters passed her, she tried to speak, perhaps to apologize or to find some way to bridge the chasm she had created, but Dan and Olivia didn't even notice her. She had become invisible. 20 minutes later, they were outside. The cool night air of Manhattan felt like a benediction after the stifling, toxic atmosphere of the auction house. Olivia held the heavy, leather-bound volume against her chest, the scent of old paper and history rising from it. They walked down the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in the puddles of a recent rain. The roar of the city felt distant, muffled by the weight of the moment. "You didn't have to do that, Dan," Olivia said softly, her voice finally beginning to steady. $1 million. We could have gotten it for much less. I would have understood if we'd lost it. Don stopped and turned her to face him. The streetlights cast long shadows, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, protective love. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "It wasn't about the book, Olivia," he said. "The book is a piece of history, and I'm glad you have it. But that $1 million wasn't for the paper or the ink. It was for the look on that woman's face when she realized she couldn't touch you. It was for every second you had to stand there and feel like you didn't belong. You belong wherever you want to be, Livy. And I will spend every cent I have to make sure the world knows that." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of relief and overwhelming gratitude. "I just wanted to honor my grandfather. I felt like I was failing him in there." "You didn't fail him," Dan said, pulling her into a warm embrace. "He taught you that nature doesn't care about social barriers. He taught you that the most important things are often the ones the world overlooks. By standing your ground in that room, you honored him more than the book ever could." She pulled back and looked at the volume in her hands. She opened it to a random page, her fingers tracing the elegant, faded script of William Thornwell. The annotations were dense, filled with observations about the resilience of desert flowers and the hidden strength of mountain vines. "Do you remember why I fell in love with you?" Dan asked, a playful smile touching his lips. Olivia laughed, the sound bright and clear in the night air. "Because I told you a 3-hour story about the history of the Honeycrisp apple?" "Exactly," Dan said, taking her hand and leading her toward their waiting car. "Because while everyone else was trying to tell me how much their yachts cost, you were explaining the cross-pollination process. You were real in a world full of ghosts, Olivia. You still are." As their car pulled away from the curb, they passed a group of photographers who had gathered, hoping for a glimpse of the billionaire couple. But Dan and Olivia weren't looking at the cameras. They were leaning toward each other, heads bowed over an old book, talking about roots and healing and the things that truly last. Inside the auction house, the party continued, but the air had gone stale. The story of what had happened with Lot 42 would be told and retold for years. A cautionary tale for the arrogant and a legend for those who believed in the quiet power of dignity. Victoria Sinclair would find that her invitations were no longer as coveted, and the chairs she sat in were no longer the center of the room, because in one night, the elite had been reminded of a fundamental truth. Wealth can buy a seat at the table, and it can buy a first edition book, but it can never, ever buy the grace of a woman who knows her own worth. True power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need diamonds to be seen. It resides in the hearts of those who carry their purpose like a lantern. Lighting the way through the shadows of a world obsessed with the surface, Olivia and Dan drove through the night, leaving the glitter of the auction house far behind. They were going home, back to the world that mattered, carrying with them a legacy that had finally been brought back into the light. The book was safe, the memory was honored, and for the first time in a long time, the roots were exactly where they were supposed to be. The lesson of the Northbridge auction wasn't about the money spent, but about the values defended. It was a reminder that behind every simple person is a story of depth, history of struggle, and a heart that deserves respect. In a world that often judges by the cover, it is the content within that truly defines the soul. And so, the story of the woman in the black dress became a beacon. It reminded everyone who heard it that you should never mistake silence for weakness or simplicity for a lack of substance. For sometimes, the most extraordinary treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true, breathtaking value.